Hello and welcome to the 9th Annual San Antonio Book Festival. So excited to be here with these two brilliant authors and their debut novels. My name is Dalia Azim and I'll be moderating the conversation today. The title of our conversation is What We Did and Did Not Inherit, Fictional Families That Confront the American Dream. I'm going to introduce our authors and then be asking them questions for the majority of the time that we're here today. And then at the last 10 minutes or so, we'll take audience questions. So I'll remind you, but you'll want to put your questions in the Q&A box that you should see in your screens, on your screens, and then we'll take them from there. So first I have the pleasure of introducing Gabriella Garcia, who is the recipient of the Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and a Steinbeck Fellowship from San Jose State University. Her fiction and poems have appeared in Best American Poetry, Tin House, Ziziva, Iowa Review, and elsewhere. She is the daughter of immigrants from Mexico and Cuba and lives in the Bay Area. A Woman in Salt is her first novel and was recently chosen as Good Morning America's April Book Club pick. And since it came out at the very end of March, it has also officially become a New York Times bestseller. Congratulations, Gabriella. That's a huge deal. Simon Han, who I'm also very excited to introduce, was born in Tianjin, China, and raised in various cities in Texas. His stories and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, The Texas Observer, Guernica, the Iowa Review, Electric Literature, and LitHub. The recipient of several fiction awards and arts fellowships, he lives in Carrollton, Texas. Nights When Nothing Happened is his debut novel. So for those of you who have just appeared and are lucky to hear about these authors for the first time, I do encourage you to buy their beautiful books. They're really incredible. I've spent the past 2 weeks just kind of living in these books and I just loved them. We hope you'll consider buying their books from Nowhere Bookshop in particular, which is the book festival's official bookseller. Independent bookstores have been hit especially hard during the pandemic, and it's really wonderful to support them and these writers by buying through Nowhere, which you can see. You should be able to see a button on your screen as well to buy their book directly. So finally, just put your questions in the Q&A and we will get to them in the last 10 minutes of the session. But I will start by asking both authors, both of your novels are really, they build layered, complex narratives by rotating through a cast of related characters. And I'm really curious if these families that you depict in your books, like if they arrive sort of fully formed, or if there was a particular character that drew you into each narrative. And I kind of want to leave it up to each author, just like if you feel like jumping in, but if we have like the awkwardness of like the Zoom, you know, then I can call on people, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I can go. Yeah, I think when I knew that I wanted to write, you know, sort of a non-linear timeline, not a non-traditional Western story structure. And so I sort of knew early on that I wanted to bring in all of these different voices and just write in very different styles throughout each character. Yeah, I think when I started, I wasn't sure like which voice was going to sort of be the main hinge in the narrative. And I think as I was writing, that character sort of became Jeanette, who is the daughter of Cuban immigrants in Miami, and she's sort of a similar age to me. And even though we're really different, I feel like maybe that was just like the easiest character for me to sort of inhabit, or whose voice just sort of came to me most easily. So I kept sort of returning to that character. But yeah, that wasn't like super clear to me when I first started. It just sort of ended up there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I sort of had a gradual process of figuring out, you know, the voices in my novel. My novel actually started as a short story from only one character's perspective of Jack, the boy in the family. But I think what made me continue to think about the story is how Jack was a very like different person depending on context, like where he was, whether he was in China or he was in suburb of Dallas, and also who he was around, whether he's interacting with his father or his mother or his little sister. So I think a central interest of my book became like how this four-person family relates to one another and their surroundings. And I love what you said, Gabriella, about like sort of trying to push against this like traditional Western structure. And I was thinking about how, so much of that structure is kind of predicated on sort of individuals like trying to get whatever they want and then facing some kind of roadblock. But I really wanted to write a story about just like individuals relating to one another. It was important to me that they came as like a package, but also that they could be different people depending on context, because that's also my experience of just being. We're always influenced by our surroundings and how we relate to that.
That's interesting. I want to jump to another question that this relates to, and maybe Gabrielle sort of pointed to this with talking about like sort of the non-traditional story structure. But I was struck that in both of these novels, they start in like a contemporary moment with a more contemporary character and then flash back into the deeper past. Like in Gabriella's book, we go back to Cuba in the 1860s. And Simon, with your book, I think like halfway through, we go back to China at like, is it the dawn of the communist era, essentially?
Sort of not the very beginning, but yeah, in the middle stages. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's such a skillful way to create like a non-traditional story, and I'm curious about those decisions and if it was deliberate to kind of start in the present and then go backwards rather than create like a linear narrative for these families. Simon, do you want to start this time?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that I'm trying to think, what I was thinking when I wrote it, which I never remember. But I guess I was thinking about just how time often works for immigrant characters like mine, who I think they're carrying, again, like different versions of themselves that exist in different times, even as they just walk through the present of their lives. And I think that also relates to how memory works. And in the beginning, I think these are characters who really wanted to be in the present moment. They had sort of staked this new life in this sort of cookie cutter suburb of Plano, Texas. And within this life, they kind of wanted to start over, or like have this kind of blank slate to work off of, where they could kind of convince themselves that whatever baggage they were carrying from their past no longer affected them. But as the story progresses, I think that those illusions begin to break down. And I think for me, that was a sort of natural place to also bring in the past, particularly for Liang, the father who underwent a lot of trauma in his childhood in China, and sort of has experienced a lot of stories from his own father about the past and about the sort of tensions within his parents' relationship, and as well as it relates to the sort of issues that the country was going through, at the dawn of the land reform movement and the Cultural Revolution. And so all of that sort of mixed together, and it began to be something he had to confront, whereas in the beginning of the story they were trying to ignore it, I guess.
Yeah, I love what you said about sort of memory. And I think, so much of my novel is about stories, like the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, the stories that get passed down to us, how characters are affected both by the stories they know and just as much by the stories they don't know. So I think when I was thinking about the structure, I wanted it to sort of feel like memory, or sort of the way that history and stories get passed down, and how you sort of never get the full picture, or you can see it so differently from different perspectives. It can be really fractured. There can be all of these spaces of unknowing where you're just sort of filling in that white space. And so I think that's sort of what I was thinking about, the sort of historical chapters interacting with the present day chapters, not even necessarily directly or literally, but I sort of also wanted the structure to sort of feel like echoes. There are sort of certain things that kind of echo across generations, and that's sort of how I envisioned it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both for sharing. That's really interesting. Can you each talk a little bit about the research that went into creating these kind of deeper histories, like the backstory narratives? I guess both in terms of like when in your novel process you decided to layer that in, and how you did the research to get there. And maybe just we'll go back and forth with Gabriella. If you want to start, that would be great.
Yeah, so the sort of furthest chapter that's furthest back, which happens like in the 19th century, that sort of came to me actually from a trip that I took to Cuba, and I went to this museum where they had on display all of these letters from Victor Hugo in the 19th century to like Cuban independence fighters and workers. And I became really fascinated by that sort of interplay between the literary culture of the time and also, the political movement. And so that led me to more research about cigar rolling workshops during that time. And my family was always really into cigars, but so I grew up around some of these cigars like Romeo y Julietas and Montecristos, and I never realized that those names actually came from books that were really popular in the tobacco workshops. So I just became like really fascinated with this stuff and started sort of researching it before I was even sure how it was gonna like fit into the narrative. But I did a bunch of archival research, and I was traveling a lot back and forth to Cuba, and just reading a lot. Yeah, I mean it's definitely easier to research when it just feels fun, when I'm just like super fascinated by the information. So I sort of had to also like pull myself back sometimes and just be like, I need to write the actual chapter. But yeah, that's sort of how it came together.
I love that.
Yeah, I love the aspect of in the cigar workshops of the like there being a reader during the workshops. It's something I didn't know about, and it was like at once like really like deeply romantic, but also like very fraught, obviously, and became a political aspect. I just thought it was incorporated in the novel in such a like complex way. And I guess as you're talking about sort of I'm doing research about these histories that you're sort of in a way part of your history, but also something that you kind of encountered without necessarily knowing all the details growing up. I mean, I sort of I grew up in the setting of my novel, Plano, Texas, and I also didn't know any of the history of this place. But I have to say that even now, all these years later, I didn't ever feel that much of a desire to know the history of what I always thought was a fairly boring place. And then it sort of dawned on me that like where does that come from? That kind of feeling that the suburbs are this kind of historyless place that that sort of contains no stories within them, and I think that's often by design. I think it's the way these places are constructed to also kind of erase the often difficult and complicated and dark histories of how they were made, and who is welcome, who is excluded, and I think by that, so doing research was important to just kind of see the context in which my characters exist, even if my characters themselves don't know these histories. I think I as a writer needed to know them, so that I could understand why my characters felt so disconnected from this place. And so it was weird to kind of go back to my hometown and like go to these like very local small museums, and I don't know, these like that were very much like set up by just like a few community members, and they probably thought like I was like a, I don't know, like a high schooler like doing a school project or something. But I learned a bit about just not things about like the natural landscape and what Plano was like before it started to sort of grow in the population. Learned about like various sort of scandals, that the city had, and also, kind of stepped back and did more research about the suburbs in general and the sort of systems that it was born out of, especially post World War II, and the way that it was sort of this privileged place for white middle class Christians, and how that looks now when you look at how the suburbs are changing, with the, in my novel, there's a giant sort of Asian American population that's moving to Plano, and how that's changing the landscape. And so, it was all sort of, I don't know how exactly that I brought all of that into the novel, but it was, I think, just important for me to know, as I was writing it, it hopefully added some additional layer or texture to the work.
I thought it was fascinating. I didn't know anything about Plano, and I think that reading of the suburbs is really it's really provocative, in a good way. I wonder. I mean, the stories that these novels tell are so different, and yet they both do tackle the idea of migration through or to Texas. And I know I'm hoping that Gabriella also can talk a little bit about her past work as an organizer for migrants, who you worked at one of the largest family detention facilities in South Texas, I believe. So I just I thought that was something we should talk about. We're at the San Antonio Book Festival, and migration through Texas is a big theme in both of these books.
Yeah, sure. And just to clarify, I didn't work in the facility. I was working for some national organization. So I traveled a lot to Texas and visited a lot of women who were in these family detention centers. I was working during the Obama administration when a lot of these centers were first built and first came into existence. Yeah, and I think, I was doing that work for many years before I sort of pursued an MFA and started writing the book. And some of the chapter that takes place in a detention center sort of came out of snippets of things that I was writing during that time. I think before I ever had any idea that it would become a book, I think it was just sort of my way of processing some of the work that I was doing, but I ended up building it out into this larger narrative. But I think what's always interesting or what's been interesting to me since publishing this book is that, sometimes I get people telling me that it feels very timely or like of the moment, which is so interesting to me because I wrote it, long before I ever thought Trump would be president, or before, this moment. Like, it's just, it, takes place, I think in 2014, these chapters in the detention center. And I think, you know, the biggest difference back then was just that getting any sort of nationwide media coverage on a lot of this stuff was really difficult, you know? And so, you know, sometimes it felt like I was just sort of writing in this vacuum. But yeah, I think, you know, I think I was also sort of interested in writing against some of the like flattening of these stories. You know, there's a sort of flattening of Latinx identity, of immigrant identity. You know, this idea that like all immigrants coming through the border, coming from Mexico, and so I wanted to sort of, you know, go into more multifaceted depiction of immigration. You know, I sort of don't think, you know, another thing that I get asked about often is like, you know, writing about the immigrant experience, and I sort of buck against the idea that there is an immigrant experience. I feel like there are many immigrant experiences, and, you know, also, you know, just coming from Latin America, there's so much based on race and class and reasons for migration. And my novel sort of depicts like these big two families who are coming under who came under very different circumstances, you know, and I sort of wanted these characters to feel really multifaceted. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the label of timely is really interesting to me too, because I've gotten that too, about my book, especially considering the sort of the rise in anti-Asian violence and the conversations that are now becoming more prominent about that now. But my book is set in 2003. So it's like, you know, it does ask some of these same questions about what does it mean to be safe and feel safe. But it's interesting to me that it can be like timely even when it's, anyway. Yeah, I've just been thinking about that. And I think part of the reason why I said it in 2003 is that I feel like these are, it's a different context for understanding like where my characters are coming from, especially post 9/11. And I think especially in Plano, the Asian American population was a bit more invisible than they are now. And I think that also has caused like different sort of dynamics both within the Asian American community and outside of it. But I was interested in how sort of these stories are always just revealing different sides of themselves, even in the present. Like I, you know, obviously wanted the story to feel relevant to our current situation. But it is a sort of fraught thing to try to like understand like who your audience is, I guess, and what feels timely to one reader or audience may have always felt like something that has been at the forefront of your mind for, you know, for years and years before that. And so how do you grapple with that, what feels like a kind of disconnect? It's just sort of strange. I don't really have that much to add to that, but yeah.
Thank you both for sharing that. These sections, or at least the part talking about Gloria and the detention center, and then Simon, in your novel, I was struck when Leung has his own experiences with law enforcement. I thought that you both did really incredible jobs sort of depicting challenges of communication and just language. And like in the Gloria section, for instance, there's no quotation marks around the dialogue. Simon, I think that there's some really moving explanations of just sort of that struggle with Leung as well. And I wonder just sort of like if there was like a deliberate, like what the was like in writing English language novels, like how you sort of struggle with that common immigrant experience in fiction.
Yeah, I guess I can jump in. When I think about these sort of institutions, like in my novel, it's, you know, various institutions that my characters struggle with are like schools and police and later child protective services and you know, these are institutions that are tasked to serve the people, but I think the question arises, like, who are they really serving? You know, who are they? Who is really the insider and outsider in these kinds of dynamics, and how is that sort of ingrained even in very like policies and procedures that, you know, that they follow. They seem to follow with every single family, regardless of context. And so that I think presents a challenge to a character who may not be able to express himself in the most clearest way in English, like with Liang. He's there's this very thorny situation in which he doesn't write like. It would be easier, I think, for someone who's more fluent in the language to sort of just explain all the intricacies of what brought him to this moment and how this was all just a big misunderstanding. But he's not quite able to do that. And his family is also sort of feeling the same pressure to sort of follow the rules of the institutions, and so it just becomes a sort of performance, I think, like where you sort of have to like perform in a way that makes yourself look good, or makes yourself kind of fall in line with what these institutions demand you to be, and kind of privileges a kind of character who is quiet or silent, and is accommodating, and that doesn't always describe every kind of person, and so that was something I was interested in my book.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like yeah, you use language so interestingly. Like, even I'm thinking about like the emails from Liang to his wife, and like how that tone shifts. It's interesting. I think, yeah, in the chapter with Gloria, you're right. I was thinking about sort of, you know, language, and also just these spaces of not, you know, people just not understanding each other or not wanting to understand. And you know, that was sort of my experience too when I was working with a lot of women in detention, was that there were often these language barriers, and it wasn't even just always you know, English and another language. Like, sometimes there were women who were assumed to speak Spanish who actually spoke indigenous languages, and there were no interpreters, and you know, so there was sort of this dynamic constantly. And I think you sort of see that in some of the conversations. Like, there's a conversation, you know, with Gloria and one of the staff at the detention center, and he's trying to get her to sign this form, and it's like a sort of one-sided conversation on both sides, you know. And in terms of like the quotation marks and stuff like that sort of varies from chapter to chapter. And I think I was just really thinking about how the style and the tone and the structure could also fit the content of each chapter. And in that one, I think there are these spaces of people not hearing each other. There are these ways that dialogue just sort of bleeds into internal thinking and monologue, and you're not even always sure. Like, so yeah, I think I was sort of thinking about that. And there's sort of like, for me, like different ways to sort of portray that space of people not hearing each other. Like, it's not always just you know, writing in Spanish and the other character doesn't understand. Like, I feel like I was sort of, I wanted to portray some of that even in just how those sections are written. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting to hear you both talk about it, and you're right. There's like these different ways to come at it, like whether it's letters or emails or conversation, and it just shows from that struggle and that sort of language acquisition or lack thereof, you know, and from a lot of different angles. It makes it really rich, and felt very true. I wanted to talk about what seemed like these kind of trailblazing women in both novels. Simon Patty seems like just an incredible, you know, engineer whose prowess essentially brings her whole family to the US. And maybe you can disabuse me of my misconceptions. I don't know if there's like, if she's part of a trend of a lot of women doing this, or if she is unique. I feel like it sort of inverts a lot of immigrant stories where it's like a male-led immigration. Maybe I'm being too reductive. And then I also, in Gabriella's book, was really struck by Maria Isabel as being like one of the only women on the floor in the factory that's rolling cigars. And I'm just curious about this desire to portray these like trailblazers.
Oh, is it my turn? Well,
sorry, I
guess
just fell off with
that. Yeah, well, I could jump in. Yeah, I think it's sort of complicated in that certainly like Patty is one of the only women like as she was growing up like in the tech field, studying physics and later electrical engineering, and I think, but at the same time, being in the tech field, she becomes this sort of prioritized immigrant based on U.S. immigration law, and so that does sort of help her to bring the rest of her family to the States, and but I think she's sort of I think she's a brilliant person, and she finds a lot of meaning in what she does. That was important to me, to not like just make her this character who's sort of like blindly pursuing this thing that gives her kind of money, or is it like I guess to backtrack a little bit, I think she comes off to some people as a kind of workaholic, as someone who's sort of like never home and is like obsessed with her job. But it was really important to me to make this job also sort of weirdly like beautiful for her. Like it's like this thing, this idea of building these tiny microchips that paves the way for the future. Like that's very important to her. At the same time, she's facing a lot of the pressures, I think, of being one of the only women in this field, and also being an immigrant, and also having these like gendered expectations of being the sort of caretaker at home, and it's just frankly impossible to do all of those things at once, and so I think it just struggles with trying to balance all these different projections of like who she's supposed to be onto her. But she is probably a kind of character who, as a result, really ducks her head down and tries to like work within the system that constrains her, and that for me is a sort of tragic thing, in that she has to sort of sacrifice a lot of what really aches her. You know, I hope that the novel kind of shows that as a sort of tragedy rather than kind of supporting that. Like I don't think it's fair that she has to do that, but ultimately she has to be also the kind of character who keeps her family together after they go through a crisis. So she has to just balance and handle so many roles. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I mean, I sort of started out very intentionally wanting to write about women. Like it's in the title, obviously, but also, you know, there's like a matrilineal family tree that's only the women in the beginning. And you know, all of the voices belong to women. And I think maybe part of that impulse is just that I grew up in a very matrilineal family. Like my mother was a single mother, and she had all sisters. I had all sisters. My grandmother had all sisters. You know, I just grew up surrounded by women. And just never felt a lack in that, you know. And so I was, you know, particularly with the character of Maria Isabel, I was sort of thinking about how, you know, she's sort of living within the constraints of the time that she's living, you know, but trying to sort of find that space of, for, I guess, freedom, you know. But it's so complex because, for example, she sort of finds some of that freedom in these readings, in the workshops, while also being fully aware that like all of the perspectives that she's getting, even about Cuban women, are mostly coming through, you know, these white European writers, or even, you know, European descended Cuban writers. And you know, she also finds that she sort of finds some kind of freedom through marriage, even if it's not like necessarily what she most wants, but within again the constraints of that time, like that's sort of how she finds you know, the space to survive. And so yeah, I wanted to sort of write these characters who are sort of blazing their way, but also sort of show the complexity of what that trailblazing results in, you know. I also sort of wanted to make sure that I wasn't portraying these characters as like solely strong, you know. Sometimes that, you know, having to sort of function within those patriarchal structures and make your way like results in loss. And I wanted to sort of portray all of these women in the fullness of their humanity.
Thank you for sharing that, both of you. And I want to say, Simon, I was really impressed by Patty's trajectory, but I was really moved by Leung's. And I thought that like his life as a photographer, even though he didn't have the career that he might have wanted in the US, I thought that was portrayed so beautifully. Just to say that I think that both of those experiences, like they balanced each other out in a really profound way. So I feel like both of these novels are part of this rich and growing and very diverse tradition of like immigration stories, novels about immigration, which is my favorite genre or subgenre of fiction. Can you talk about writers or books that influenced you or inspired you along the way? Gabriella, if it's okay to start.
Yeah, books that influenced me. I think I'm always just really interested in narratives that center women and relationships between women. So I think, I mean, a book that I just have read a million times since I was young is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. And, you know, a lot of Elena Ferrante's novels, which also sort of deal with relationships between women and friendships, are something that I thought a lot about. A lot of Toni Morrison's novels, which also deal with complex relationships between women. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think I've been drawn to, like, especially for this book, like as far as thinking about the book as an immigrant novel, which is always, it's a pretty fraught and complicated label to sort of work with, but I like books that sort of complicate that label and sort of have expanded for me the possibilities of what these stories can be. And so writers like Gish Jen and Cheng Rei Li, A Gesture Life was a book that I thought handled the sort of a sense of sort of unsettling, this sort of unsettling feeling under the placid surface of a character who's quote unquote quiet. Like, I think that this idea, like, I guess my writing has been described as quiet a lot, and I just wanted to sort of, I wanted to complicate the idea of what quiet means, and how quiet can manifest in different ways, and so I'm often drawn to writers that do that like, or may not be incredibly flashy on the surface level, but you sort of, there's just like a lot going on underneath, but then also, like, going way back, I guess one of the first real, and I think a sort of immigrant novel that I was drawn to was Dracula, and it actually makes its way in my book, but I've always thought of it as an immigrant story, and so that influenced not just me, but the character of Jack in my book.
Maybe one of the narratives that complicates and deepens both of your books is the way that they deal with addiction and inherited trauma. And I'm wondering, Gabriella, you said at the beginning that Jeanette was kind of the character that brought you into the book. And I'm wondering what it means to you to portray the characters who are facing these struggles, and whether you feel like there's a connection between the displacement and the trauma that they're experiencing.
I think, yeah, I think I was also thinking about the sort of how the, like, not naming things, or like the silences that exist between characters as a result of trauma, like, leads to some of these fractures, you know? And so throughout the novel, there are all of these ways that people are sort of not hearing each other, or these spaces of silence, you know, that exist. And I think that's I think it's in part displacement, but I think it's also sort of like an inherited thing that happens through the generations, you know, that these things aren't named and talked about, and then that results in, like, you know. And so I think I was thinking about how that sort of functions within families, or even just like on a grander scale historically, and thinking about, like, the consequences of those silences. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, I guess the character in my novel that this maybe speaks most to is Liang, who kind of in his childhood witnessed something very traumatic, and even though he was there for it, he sort of was always kind of told different stories of it. It's basically told that what you saw is not what you saw, and I think that sort of puts him in this kind of space of always even engaging with his present reality as if it's this kind of tenuous thing, like, not just his past but his present, like, this kind of unstable footing that I think just becomes magnified through the process of immigration and displacement, and also probably has been passed down and inherited to his children in ways that are not direct, but you know, like, I think it relates to the lack of intimacy between the parents and children, in the sense that, you know, for Liang, like, whenever he's tried to reach for intimacy with his father, he was sort of punished for it, and so he sort of grew up seeking intimacy through like memories or stories, thinking of his mother, for example, who died before he was born, or died before he could really remember her. Thinking of her as this character in a story, basically, who could give him what he needed. And so I was interested in how, what, like how we tell different stories of what we've experienced in order to protect ourselves or to give ourselves what we need, but how that also complicates just the real life interactions between human beings when we're always living in so many different stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think that points to, both of your answers point to just like another thing that you both do very deftly, which is to portray those intergenerational dynamics and just those different generations. People are probably hearing all these like buzzing noises because we have so many questions that are coming in for our authors, and we were going to leave the last 10 minutes, but I think I'll transition to that because I was going to ask questions about what are you working on next, etc. But we can do that at the end if we have time. Just a reminder, if you have questions for our authors, do put them in the Q&A tab, and we'll start there. And then I've also been getting some questions from one of our friends at the San Antonio Book Festival. The first question is for Gabriella from Cheryl, and she's wondering, had you read or seen Anna in the Tropics when you began researching in Cuba?
I saw that when I was like young. I think I saw it like in the theater when I was like in middle school or something. So I don't remember a lot of the details, but yeah, I know it takes place in like a cigar workshop in Tampa, and I had been to Ybor City in Tampa a few times, but most of my research was really on the cigar workshops and lectures was really focused in Cuba, so it wasn't like a text that I like revisited, but it would be interesting to sort of revisit that now. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And then Simon, for you from Mary Beth, she wonders how long you have lived or how long you did live in Plano, Texas.
Oh, I lived there for about 10 years when I was growing up. So from like 1997 to like 2007, and then I left Texas for a while, and I only recently came back to Texas last summer.
Great, thank you. And then for both of you, from Robin, how do you recommend writing characters whose personalities and motivations may be different from your own?
I think it's actually, for me, useful, like, or maybe easier to write characters who are different from me. Because I think if I were to write sort of really autobiographically, or I don't know, I think it's just harder to have the distance from yourself and to even understand like your own motivations. And so, I feel like my characters are all sort of flawed in some way, and sometimes act in ways that I wouldn't, or make decisions that maybe I would make differently. I think sort of trying to understand the full history of a character, even if everything doesn't go into the book, helps with sort of thinking through motivations or where those decision points would actually come from for these people who have a very different lens into the world than me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It's generally easier to write characters that are at least in some ways different from me, and it always becomes a kind of composite where I see my parts of myself in every character I write, but I find it most almost like more interesting for me as a writer to like put the weird thoughts that I have in my head in like a character who's so just so like on the surface level different from me. I think like I tend to, if I had to relate to any of my characters, it might be like Patty, the mother in my family, more so than someone like Jack, who probably has some of the more like autobiographical, like surface level elements. And I think that creates sort of a sort of almost like a playground where you can put different parts of the story together in a way that tells I don't know, makes it feel more urgent, or makes it feel yeah, like just feels like a question, like you can walk more directly into the questions that interest you. Because I feel like in real life, I'm always, as we all do, we all have to sort of put on a mask, and we have to perform, and we have to fulfill certain expectations. But in fiction, like you put on a different kind of mask through the act of fictionalizing that actually allows me to talk about what I really want to talk about.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions related to mental illness that I think I'll just group together and see if you have any thoughts you want to add to this. One question is, what do you think the increased public discussion of mental illness in recent years, and also as a result of COVID, will mean for research and treatment of depression and anxiety? And might other mental illnesses be neglected? Related, what do you think the relationship is between depression or treatment of depression and creativity? I know you all are novelists, and this may not be your area of expertise, so we can move on, but I thought I would pass that along.
I guess I can try. I mean, I definitely can't answer those questions directly, but I mean, I was interested in, I think you mentioned, Gabriella, a while back about like, what does it mean to name something versus not name something? And it's like tricky as a fiction writer, because I really resist the act of like diagnosing my characters or something, because that's just not what I'm interested in as a writer. Like, and I think my characters themselves don't really have the language to even think of themselves as struggling with mental illness or trauma, especially in the time period that they're living in, and in this like closed sort of Chinese American community, where the idea of even, say, going to therapy would just be a very foreign thing. So I guess I was just interested in writing a very specific story of characters who exist in this specific circumstance, and kind of just sitting there with them, and how that might feel. I don't know. I didn't want to, I guess, write a sociological story about mental illness, but I did want to explore some of those consequences of either naming it or not naming it.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I guess it's an interesting question. I think, some of my characters are maybe like seeking sort of relief, like the character of Jeanette and her substance use is a kind of self-medicating at points, I think. But you're right. I think, I agree with Simon. Like, there's sort of, there are these silences, there are these sort of ways that characters are not even trying to see themselves always, that makes naming something like depression tricky. Yeah, I don't know. I would have to think about this question a lot more.
No, it's complicated, but I think those are both really thoughtful answers. Thank you for sharing that. Another audience member asks, how did working on these books change during the pandemic? Did the pandemic and the resulting talk about social isolation, increased grief, etc., affect what you were able to find? And I'll just add, I guess, that I would assume, just sort of knowing publication schedules, you probably had sold or were done with these books by the time the pandemic hit, and maybe it has hit subsequent projects in these ways, but I'll put that out there.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I had, you know, written the book long before the pandemic. I actually sold it like two years ago. So yeah, I mean, what did happen during pandemic was, you know, working on proofreading or copy edits, you know, some of that was happening during the pandemic. And for me, I think it was just really hard to concentrate on anything, honestly. And I think just in terms of my writing projects and you know, I think I've had to have some grace with myself, you know. I think a lot of writers have struggled to write during this time, to find that like sort of quiet mental space that I need for myself to focus on my writing projects. So I've worked on sort of shorter things or like revisited things I wrote before. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess what I was writing during the pandemic, or trying to write, was more nonfiction that often was a sort of reflection of how the current circumstances made me rethink some of the themes of my novel, or some of the recurring ideas in my novel, like about sleepwalking, for instance, and like this tenuous grasp on reality and isolation, and these sort of blurry boundaries of experience, and as well as, like, you know, when I was thinking about how the suburbs really became a talking point of the election in a really simplistic way, like it made me rethink some of the decisions that went into my novel, and the story, like the sort of story of the suburbs that have persisted in the popular imagination. So I guess, yeah, it definitely does affect me. But as far as fiction goes, it's a bit more mysterious how I'm going to approach that. Yeah, it's like I'm sort of trying to revisit some stuff I wrote before the pandemic and haven't really put out into the world, and yeah, it's starting to ask myself, like, is this still the story I want to tell? Like, I think we've all changed as people through this experience, and maybe our stories will too.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes and I think just one more question, so I'll try to squeeze it in before we wrap up. Daria asks, what made you choose to write fiction rather than going the route of memoir and telling your own and your family's stories? Did either of you consider writing a memoir, or was it always fiction? Always fiction. That's an easy answer.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I admire people who write memoir a lot, because I think it's something that I just can't do. I'm not good at, you know. And I mean, to be completely honest, I just love making things up, you know. I think it would be really hard for me to write nonfiction, because I would just want to lie all the time, you know. That's just my preferred mode of writing.
Yeah, and it's weird. It's somehow, fiction for me just feels even more personal than writing a memoir. Not that I've really tried to write much of like memoiristic stuff, but so yeah, I just gravitate towards fiction as well.
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, I think that brings us to time, and I just want to say thank you again to Simon and Gabriella. I've loved this conversation. I loved your books. I hope everybody buys them, and to make that last reminder that Nowhere Bookshop is the festival's bookstore, and you can buy their their books right this second, if you choose to. Yeah, this was really wonderful. I loved spending the last 2 weeks reading these books back to back. They're beautiful in their own right, but it was really fun to think about the affinities between them as well. So thank you for being here and for sharing your perspectives and your time with us. Hopefully, when your next books come out, we can all hang out in San Antonio or Austin at one of the book festivals. And with that, I will just say thank you to everyone and have a good rest of your festival. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.